Hello, welcome back everybody. Take your seats. Palun võtke istet. Hello, Nick.
Hello, how are you? Yeah, I can see you.
So,
can you hear me?
We are approaching our last session today. We have been talking about the lockdowns, that they don't work very well and
yes,
that they cause much more harm than they achieve positive results. And now we are approaching the last topic of our day. For me, who have lived like my first nearly 30 years in a totalitarian country, the signs of what are around us today, that people are giving away their freedoms easily for some kind of perceived security, they're very terrifying. And that's the topic we are going to talk now. The first speaker is Nick Hudson from South Africa. Nick is an investor and entrepreneur, and for the last year and a half at least, he has spent, I don't know how much, but a big amount of his time running a network called PANDA or pandata.org. If you haven't looked this or found this environment yet, please check. There's lots of interesting podcasts and other information. And Nick, you haven't seen this yet. This is our article which came out from print, or actually it is in print. It is a preprint today. It will be published in September number of Estonian academic journal Academia. Those people who are here, they have the privilege to get the hard copy. If you haven't got one, get it on your way out. For everybody else who is following us on the internet, you have to order the journal Academia. I recommend to do this, or at least buy the September issue. But now, the floor is yours, Nick. And we didn't have very much time to agree what is your title, but it's probably related to restrictions, freedoms, and pandemia.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. Are you hearing me properly?
Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, yes, PANDA is an international organization started in South Africa, divided into three teams. We have a science-oriented team that tries to process all the very complicated stories that arise out of the epidemic, not only the progress of the epidemic itself, the effectiveness of measures, the modes of transmission, and so on. We have a communications team which packages all the information that's generated, and an operations team that supports the other two units with IT and financial support. It's represented in 30 countries worldwide. Because of the intense censorship and cancel culture that prevails at the moment, most of our scientists, very sadly, have to be cryptic members, so you will not see their names on our website. This is a terrible state of affairs in science. We hold a weekly science meeting, a symposium that's attended regularly by anywhere between 40 and 80 scientists, discussing various aspects of the epidemic. The title of the presentation is COVID and the Clash of Our Ideologies. And I was interested to see how one of your earlier presenters focused on that, because I do think it's very important to look at the epidemic through that lens, and not always to remember that what precedes ideology is propaganda, and what precedes propaganda is a political agenda. All of these are present. In March, PANDA did a presentation called The Ugly Truth About the COVID-19 Lockdowns, and that presentation went viral. After 500,000 views in a few days, it was still accelerating, being watched at a rate of around 12,000 views per hour. Its contents were mostly based on the actual statements and publications of the WHO and CDC of the US, and we used these to show that the received narrative of the COVID epidemic was false in all its key elements. Though there have been precisely zero criticisms of the factual content of that presentation, YouTube censored that presentation, citing non-specific violations of its community guidelines. In that presentation, we showed the narrative that was behind the fear, the false narrative that there was a deadly novel virus sweeping the planet, spread by droplets and fomites, that nobody is immune and there is no treatment, that asymptomatic people were major drivers of a disease, that PCR tests diagnosed COVID, and so that we all had to lock down and wear our masks until everyone is vaccinated. Even once we're vaccinated, the variants will haunt us forever, and long COVID and reinfections are of major concern, and that anybody who challenges any aspect of this narrative is a danger to society. But all of those elements are false. In reality, a virus that presents high risk to a few and negligible risk to the vast majority of the population hits some regions. It's airborne. It spreads by minute particles. Few people are susceptible to severe disease. There are several available treatments. Asymptomatic people are not major drivers of the disease epidemic. Lockdowns and mask mandates, which were never recommended before, in fact, warned against in all the pre-epidemic guidelines in many countries all over the world. They were tried, they haven't worked, and as your previous speakers discussed, they've caused an enormous amount of harm, with hundreds of millions of people being cast into poverty, 1.5 billion school children having had their educations disrupted, some of them now to the point that that disruption is more or less permanent. There's no chance of catching up. Variants are not of concern. The PCR test does not diagnose the disease. Immunity from natural infection is long-lasting, broad, and robust. And what we have done here is, instead of focusing on protecting the vulnerable have been hurt instead of helped. What I'm going to talk about is not that narrative that's been covered, as I said, in that other presentation, and I'd imagine that a lot of aspects of this have been addressed by other speakers. I want to talk about the propagandization of this narrative. We're living in a world where our institutions of science and media have been co-opted in the maintenance of a false narrative, and the narrative's main purpose is the creation and perpetuation of fear. This fear narrative has put the population into a fight or flight response, so severe that flight is the only option. The behavioral science tools of trade have little to do with fighting a viral epidemic and plenty to do with creating constant reminders of the presence of a deadly threat, even for people for whom the threat is in reality not at all deadly. This is the antithesis of sound public health messaging, which should really inform people accurately about their risk and not try to drive disproportionate fear. Dissent, which is the hallmark of scientific progress, has been ruthlessly stifled. The woke army cancels and lies, and the livelihoods of opposing scientists are threatened all the time. They're bullied out of their positions, smeared as conspiracy theorists, COVID deniers, and anti-vaxxers. While we at PANDA have been at pains to explain that this arises more from a clash of ideologies, or as Thomas Sowell would put it, a conflict of visions, the ubiquitous conspiracy theorist slur enables a very amusing joke. What's the difference between a conspiracy theory and a fact? 6 months. The recent exemplifier of this whole situation was the Fauci-gate email release. Among many embarrassments in this trove were a few of which have been reported by media. These contained the revelation that Fauci's closest scientific advisors had written to him, pointing out that the viral genome exhibited many features consistent with a laboratory origin. Much of the ensuing exchange with his scientists was redacted, but we can see Fauci hastily convening a conference call, and within days of that, one of those scientists, Christian Anderson, who was a beneficiary of some serious funding from Fauci, was out on social media telling the world exactly the opposite of what those scientists actually believed. As the mails were released, he deleted his own incriminating posts, claiming that they'd been deleted by Twitter, which was nonsense. And upon being challenged with screenshots of the tweets, he deleted his whole Twitter account, which in anybody's view marks him as guilty. For more than a year, Legacy Media curated the lie that the lab origin was a conspiracy theory until just before the release of the Fauci emails. First, Robert Redfield, Fauci's close colleague and former head of the FDA, broke ranks, followed by Fauci himself. Fauci appeared to have perjured himself in congressional testimony, yet even after all of this, the media narrative was move on, nothing to see here. And this wasn't the only example of a fact described as a conspiracy theory. In June of last year, when we noted that neither lockdown nor mask mandate efficacy were evident in the data, and that studies supporting them were riddled with fundamental flaws, we proposed that dissident scientists arguing for airborne aerosols as the primary driver of spread were probably right, and that the droplet and fomite dogma of the World Health Organization couldn't be. That too was described as a conspiracy theory, yet in recent months, without any announcement or explanation, both the WHO and the CDC quietly added aerosols to the top of their lists of transmission mechanisms. Having focused entirely on fomite and droplet transmission in the absence of any evidence that it was at all important, the World Health Organization spoke for the first time about the importance of spatial ventilation, which was a drum that we at PANDA had been beating as the only non-pharmaceutical invention worth serious attention for more than a year. They did this without even a nod in the direction of the obvious implication, which is that this whole theater of social distancing, cloth masks, stickers, and plexiglass was pointless. What was perhaps the biggest news event of the entire epidemic was, again, almost completely ignored by the media. Nothing to see here. We covered another foundational lie, asymptomatic transmission as a driver of the disease epidemic, in our ugly truth presentation. Taking this together with airborne aerosol spread, the case for lockdowns, social distancing, and mask mandates is entirely non-existent. And the lack of evidence that we found for their effectiveness is wholly unsurprising. There should be no media house on the planet doing anything other than shouting scandal at the top of their voices, yet the silence is deafening. So I've provided you with only a glimpse of these problems. Unpacking all of them in their full depth and breadth would take more than the time that I've got. But I promise you that if you watch that ugly truth presentation and listen to this one, the question that will be on your minds is why and how. This question has caused many who see these things to go quite crazy, conjuring up really crazy embellishments and imagining smoke-filled rooms of Illuminati-like plotters intent on global depopulation or something like that. But the important thing to start with is to realize that these were far from the only major stories ignored by media and suppressed on social media platforms. From the start, PANDA had argued that there was evidence of deliberate efforts to drive fear using misrepresentations and distortions of risk. The maintenance of conspicuous interventions long after their logical basis had been demolished seemed to us to be a form of psychological warfare, because what they were salient, in your face kind of interventions. You couldn't move anywhere without seeing a mask or a separator or being tested for your temperature. There were stickers all over the place reminding people to keep 2 meters distancing, and lots of intrusions in life, curfews and lots of testing, over sanitization, spraying your hands at every corner, even in some cases, fumigation of spaces. And some of these things were really overt propaganda. Everybody will remember those falling man videos from China, and since that propaganda spread around the planet. None of us have seen anything close to that in our own countries. And that means that those videos were deliberately created, enacted to deceive. And so we went with all of these various measures that were always in our face. Lots of very kind of vivid imagery, all to remind us that there was something deadly. Now, we've managed to attract some behavioral scientists away from the teams that were promoting all of this fear-mongering. And they've helped us to unpack how carefully manipulated the advertising and communications that governments have used have been. And so when you look at this simple graphic, look him in the eyes and tell him that you always keep a safe distance. As you unpack it into its various elements, for behavioral scientists, the manipulation that takes place is clear. The fear messaging, that it only works if you have a very clear, achievable action to take. What is that action? Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. There's a lot of truth in this joke. Why isn't COVID affecting you people? Well, we don't have TV. Of course, you had to do more than turn off your television, though. In addition to advertisements, the public were confronted with an onslaught of scary headlines, when there were insufficient deaths cases, celebrity endorsements of various aspects of the narrative, and experts pretending to talk about the science, but really repeating a narrative like so many robots. Of course, our observation that this appeared to be a deliberate risk distortion earned us yet another conspiracy theorist label, even though government websites told you that they were working only in the direction of increased perception of threat. We can quote from some of them: a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened, and it could be that they are reassured by the low death rate in their demographic group. That's the kind of wording that you can see on these websites as they step through this systematic persuasion, incentivization, and coercion matrix. Persuasion was a very important part of all of this. Here you can see the young people being targeted, even though they're not really at risk of severe disease, and being told that the asymptomatic transmission was an important issue, which is a lie. A message of social approval being motivated through new behavior: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Compulsion through fines, even when it had been known for quite some time that outdoor transmission was quite rare. And this kind of very vivid advertising, I find this advert the creepiest of all of them. If you just take a minute to look at the imagery here, you know, the braces on the teeth of this person, that's specifically chosen to aim the message at youth. The useless mask and the crazed lie that taking it off would turn such a young person into a murderer. And of course, the subliminal message that it was, for the first time in history, your fault if somebody else got sick. Of course, our observation that this appeared to be deliberate risk distortion earned us another conspiracy theorist label, but evidence that we were correct emerged very early on. In Germany, when the mainstream Welt newspaper published a major expose of a classified document dubbed the Panic Papers. The investigations included details of members of that community agreeing to divert their discussions about how to communicate completely trumped up predictions for the purpose of maximizing fear to their private email addresses. They knew they were doing something wrong. They knew they were doing something wrong, and they did not want to be found out. Other revelations emerged elsewhere. A member of the UK SAGE's Spy B team, its behavioral science unit, revealed how the unit had told members that a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. Gavin Morgan, a psychologist on the team, said, clearly using fear as a means of control is not ethical. using fear smacks of totalitarianism. It's not an ethical stance for any modern government. By nature, he said, I'm an optimistic person, but all this has given me a more pessimistic view of people. It also emerged that the unit knew that masks did more harm than good, and that the decision to mandate them for healthy people was introduced primarily as a psychological control method. In Canada, regarding Ottawa's creepily named nudge unit, the Toronto Star said that a massive social science experiment that has taken place over the planet has given government important clues on how to modify citizens' behavior for other big global issues, such as climate change. An internal correspondence leak in Ireland revealed that ISAC members were instructed to review and internalize instructions to look for ways to increase insecurity, anxiety, and uncertainty, and to go after people and not institutions, because people hurt faster than institutions. And I could go on. There are many other examples. The materials describing this kind of deliberate attempt to instill fear using behavioral science, not stopping short of lying to the public, could fill a book. And in fact, they did. I would recommend to everybody that they read Laura Dodsworth's book, pictured here, called A State of Fear, which is top of the bestseller lists. And she's battled in the Censored Times to secure a review even in legacy media columns. So what has been happening to populations all over the world is that these pernicious methods have been used in a escalating, progressive kind of fashion. So you can promote a sort of boiling frog syndrome. And in doing that, what you do is gradually move the goalposts. First, we're going to protect the healthcare workers. Then we're going to just flatten the curve for 2 weeks. Then we're going to keep on locking down until the vulnerable are vaccinated, or until the above 50 are vaccinated, or until the children are vaccinated. So you have these constantly moving goalposts. And all of this manipulates the population into accepting ever-increasing encroachment until independent and critical thought is all but extinguished. It's easier after that to create an entirely polarized world. And we need to ask the question, why are we trying to create a polarized world? You need that if your mission is to divide and conquer. You want to divide the society into lockdowners and lockdown skeptics, COVID heroes and COVIDiots. And the very scary thing about all of this, in my mind, is that all of this was attempted before. And the fact that it had been attempted has actually been one of the most suppressed messages in this whole scam. If you've never read this Spiegel report about the 2009 H1N1 hoax perpetrated by vaccine manufacturers in collusion with the World Health Organization, then I'd thoroughly recommend that you do. I'd also recommend listening to our interview with the physician and politician, Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg, who played the central role in exposing that fraud. A very sinister aspect of this episode was that they came for him in advance of the COVID policy reaction, for example, by changing his Wikipedia entry in a way that painted him as some kind of asylum inmate. And of course, once again, YouTube decided to censor that interview that I did with him. How is this false narrative of COVID perpetuated with such ruthless efficiency? The chief enabler of all of this is an unbelievable degree of centralization of power. A handful of media companies control almost all the outlets, and agencies such as ANP and Project Syndicate can cause any story, true or false, to be propagated around the world across all mediums and in a heartbeat. I'm going to play a quick video clip. I hope this works. Let me see. Sorry, just 1 second. Is there any reason why I wouldn't be able to play this? Let's see. Sorry. there's an embedded video here, and it's not linking. I'm sorry. This was just an illustration of how quickly narratives can spread in a rather creepy fashion to all corners of the world, with the single messages being echoed by presenters who barely understand them. But I've got some other examples here. Major organizations of a particular ideological bent secure influence over assets they do not own by conditional donations and advertising. Notably for us, both the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and George Soros's one, the Open Society Foundation, both funded AP and Project Syndicate, and Reuters is owned by the like-minded Thompson family in Canada. And the story gets worse as the self-styled fact-checking organizations, which for the most part act to attack dissenting voices, are funded by the very same people. It's comical, even macabre, to read the sanctimonious columns of those fact-checkers after the passing of a few months. We can see them like the Spanish Inquisition, insisting that the world was flat, proclaiming zoonotic origin as settled science, simply because dozens of scientists had said it was, only to then find, as the Fauci mails were revealed, that there was indeed strong suspicion that the virus had some laboratory passage. And the major social media platforms have been corralled into a coalition called C2PA, the Coalition for Content, Provenance and Authenticity, formed by Microsoft. Twitter joined that a couple of months ago, and since then we have noticed unprecedented censorship on that platform. Simple statements of uncontested fact, such as announcing the release of more Fauci emails, or uncommented retweeting of peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, have earned people permanent suspensions from that platform. There's not even a pretense at policing misinformation, and as is always the case in censorship regimes, it is the truth that they are trying to suppress, and not any form of misinformation. A handful of organizations headed by some very powerful people have also infiltrated the vast majority of our public health institutions with funding that is modest to them, but very significant for the scientists they seek to compromise. The principal ones are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, their related entities, the World Health Organization and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the CDC, and the big pharma companies. It's simply not possible for any of the scientists in organizations funded by this crew to hold a dissenting opinion, let alone to utter one. At pain of career and financial ruin, most rationalize their way into supporting the false narrative. And the few who don't join PANDA as cryptic members, the few who don't end up joining PANDA often as cryptic members, so where they can at least voice their views privately. Media's inclination to see nothing in all of this is inexcusable. Panda's connections have made all of this information really easily available in kind of easy to access visualizations that allow you to drill down into the detail of this kind of funding. I've provided you with only a glimpse of the mechanisms behind these problems. Unpacking them all in their full depth and breadth would take days, if not weeks. So we must now turn to this question of why would anybody do this? We believe that the why question is best approached through the lens of ideology. In our view of the world, the battle lines have been drawn. The enemy we face is not a new one. What Gates, Soros, and any number of supranational organizations such as the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, the Atlantic Council, the Bilderberg Club, Common Purpose, the Global Citizen, and so on, what they represent is what the great economist I mentioned earlier, Thomas Sowell, described as the unconstrained vision. Like Stalin, they conceive of human society as a system that they, by applying their technocratic vision, can control and manage towards some kind of better social outcomes. if you visit the WEF's website, what you will encounter is a string of non-problems that they have largely invented or fabricated, and to which they admit only highly centralized global solutions. Such men would bring forth a shiny new world order, a great reset, a build back better, a fourth industrial revolution, and so on. They routinely express a close affinity for the Chinese Communist Party's methods, for its surveillance of citizens, its social credit systems, and its authoritarian ways. And all of this would be enabled by control of the human population, passported or tagged, even one day in their imaginations chipped or biologically monitored. The World Economic Forum was talking last week about being able to identify people based on their heartbeats, so that they wouldn't have to remove their masks at checkpoint stations. And all of this would afford them the capacity to nudge or prohibit or compel certain behavior or even speech. As Klaus Schwab says, you will own nothing and be happy, just before advising us that we'd better get used to eating insects because meat is going to be a rare treat. This kind of has many antecedents. I mentioned Stalin, but you could just as easily consider the Anglo-American banking cabal who funded Hitler and Mussolini. Indeed, you can pick almost any time in human history and find that an extractive, oppressive elite is obliterating all opposition, and with it all potential for knowledge growth and progress of any sort at all. For the only source of knowledge growth, the constant cycling of conjecture and criticism in the search of better explanations requires freedom of expression and preservation of local agency. Almost everyone in history died in a society that looked from a technological perspective very much like the one into which they had been born. In fact, stasis is the rule, not the exception in history, precisely because local agency has seldom been achieved as it has in the West in the last couple of 100 years. For tiny fractions of human history, there have been periods where the oppressive power and ossifying tendencies of hierarchies have been moderated. Democracy moderated $1, one vote, with one man, one vote, with generally salubrious outcomes. Democracy's current iteration took half a millennium to challenge from the spark ignited by Magna Carta, but when it did emerge, it was extremely productive and generative. Decentralization and diffusion of power unleashed the infinite potential of evolutionary knowledge growth. Poverty plummeted, and as you can see in this chart, lifespans increased. Today's technocrats advance an agenda that inherits from its forebearers a pronounced Malthusian strain that would terminate all of this, restoring our world to a drudgy and dreary kind of stasis. According to them, man is merely a passenger on spaceship Earth, which needs to be protected by Prince Charles's Terra Carta. Magna Carta was simply a mistake and it should be replaced. And so what we have is an ideological clash, not a new one, but one that's more salient than it's ever been before. On the one hand, we have elites of the unconstrained vision to whom it is in their capacity to systematize and regulate the affairs of men. And on the other, the wiser, more humble people who understand that society is complex and improvements to it are best made locally by the scientific and evolutionary process of trial and error. This contrast was beautifully illustrated by one of the strangest documents that I have ever read. In fact, when it was first brought to my attention, I suspected that I was the victim of a prank. Researchers at the illustrious MIT infiltrated several lockdown skeptic organizations, one of which appears to have been PANDA. Most fundamentally, they said about us, the groups we studied believe that science is a process and not an institution. They correctly saw that we value unmediated access to information and privilege personal research and direct reading over expert interpretations. They went on saying that its members value individual initiative and ingenuity, trusting scientific analysis only insofar as they can replicate it themselves by accessing and manipulating the data firsthand. They were surprised to find that these individuals as a whole are extremely willing to help others who have trouble interpreting graphs with multiple forms of clarification by helping people find the original sources so that they can replicate the analysis themselves by referencing other reputable studies. Data literacy, they said, is a quintessential criterion for membership within the community they have created. But you shouldn't for a minute believe that any of this was meant as a compliment, because in their conclusion, they lamented the skeptical impulse that the science simply isn't settled, promoting people to simply think for themselves to horrifying ends. That is how they see the world. For extra measure, us to the January 6th Capitol rioters. This vignette paints a picture of two startlingly different perceptions of science. On the one hand, we have TM. On the other, we have our understanding of science as a process. If you recognize in the former conception the science, in inverted commas, traits that are prevalent in the philosophies of postmodernism, such as critical theory and wokeism, then you have the measure of it. And the subsidiary concepts of these entirely self-refuting doctrines, such as cancel culture and safety culture, are also everywhere in evidence. It's important to understand that the corruption of science in this fashion is a decades-long process. In particular, the health sciences have been a chief victim, and it has been encroached upon from the other side of the political spectrum too. In the Reagan era, two shameful decisions were made. The one was to void liability for vaccine manufacturers, thus distorting incentives that they face and paving the way for them to falsely present their products as the be-all and end-all of public health. And the other was to permit those manufacturers, rather than regulators, to conduct the trials for those products. Over time, the effective oversight of those trials...
I'm sorry, Nick.
Yeah.
We are a little bit overspending the time. Can you
wrap up?
Try to wrap up,
Sure.
yes. Sorry
yes, I thought I had 40 minutes. No problem. Let me flick forward. Thing here that much more than that accountable. They tell and talking that children, you can see on these two charts in parallel. Okay, I'm going to skip through these and get to the end. Our core message here is to people to remember that they do have some power. Lockdowns aren't only wrong because no cost-benefit analysis was done. They're wrong in principle. Coercion has no place in public health whether it comes to a lockdown or a vaccine. Fear is not a virtue. And so we appeal all the time to people's courage to ask them to just say no. Are you still seeing me?
Thank you, Nick.
Good.